high stool with a little table in front of me to speak. But since it's the first time for me here, I thought I'd just do it the traditional way. What was that? Ah, look at that. Thank you, Chuck. In fact, I better grab my phone because it's also my watch. And nobody gave me any instructions on how long to speak. So I'm going to kind of tone, oh, thank you. I'm going to keep it short, no more than an hour and a half, and, you know, we'll do fine. The sun will still be shining when we're done. Actually, no, I won't inflict on you too much, but it's just really exciting for Wanda and I to be here, and we're so glad and grateful to be entering into the life of the church here at this particular time. We're excited about the potential that's resident in this congregation and in the situation of a vibrant congregation in a growing community that really needs to hear about God's love and forgiveness. I don't know if you agree with me on that, but we have a great opportunity as God's people. And so we're excited to become part of the community here. We've appreciated so much getting to know Joel and Rebecca, and Joel and I have been kind of working together. Most of you would be aware that I've been, over the last year and a half or so, I've been working with a sort of a smaller group of the congregation, walking through some visioning and building plans for the building, and those will all be unfolding over the next while. Some good things happening there. But through that period, Joel and I have got to know each other, and I think we get along okay. He hasn't expressed any concerns, so and I have none, so we're just looking forward to being part of the community here. When Joel asked me to speak today, it was several months ago, before the conversation about coming on staff and taking the role that I'm taking. And so at that time, he was sharing with me the theme that he'd been working through of life swap. And so at the time I said, well, maybe what I could talk about, because this is something that I've spent a lot of time working through, and that is really understanding our worldview as followers of Jesus and swapping out, as our scripture said, that worldly point of view for a heavenly or an eternal point of view. We no longer consider anyone from a worldly point of view as followers of Jesus. And so we've been working on that, but then I got thinking about this morning, and I thought, well, maybe I'll tell a few stories about myself and about Wanda and I, just to give you a bit of a sense of who we are, and kind of kill two birds with one stone if you're interested in killing birds. So you get to know us a little bit, but also hopefully there's an encouragement to continue to grow in our understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and how do we live that out in real time in a real world that has real problems that we as God's people have a solution for. And so I'm going to share a few different things with you. I've got more here than I can share this morning, but I'll pick and choose and try to, like I said, keep it down to an hour and a half or so. No, I'm just kidding. When I say the word or the phrase, what's your worldview, I don't know what comes to mind for you, because it's not something that we talk about a lot, is it? We just sort of live. We just have a way of seeing things, and we don't often think about, well, what are the influences that have caused us to see things the way we see them? And there's a whole host of reasons. There's no one particular one that probably is dominant in everyone's life, but some of the things that shape how we see the world are obviously our family, the family that we grew up in. Maybe it's your ethnic background, your cultural or ethnic background. And if you've done any traveling around the world, you know that Canada, for all the conversation, we actually do have a Canadian culture, and it influences us. If you've come from another part of the world, that's influenced your worldview. There are obviously political and governmental environments that maybe have begun to shape who we are. had the privilege of spending some time in Russia a couple of years ago and recognized that that's a different place than here. And for very, very significant reasons. And one of the big factors in shaping the Russian worldview is the political environment that the Russian people have lived out the last number of generations. There's your socioeconomic position in life that has shaped your worldview, and there are even other events, world events, that wars and depressions and technology and different things that shape how we see the world. There's many others I could go on, education system, maybe traumatic experiences in life, those sorts of things. But as followers of Jesus, I want to suggest to you that he calls us to understand those influences, but to rise above those influences and see things through God's eyes, see the world through God's eyes, and also being aware of those things that have shaped who we are, and work out how we see the world, not just sort of arrive at a place and stay there for the rest of our lives, but actually begin to process our role in being part of God's plan to his redemptive mission for the world around us. And it's interesting, as I've been here at the church, I'm always fascinated with the balcony, the balcony dwellers up here. Way to go. There's something in us that likes balconies. It's kind of interesting to get up and look down on things, isn't it? You go to a city, and usually, there's this thing, well, let's go to the highest building and look down on the city, if it's the CN Tower or the Empire State Building. There's times maybe you've had it where you've climbed a mountain or driven to the top of a high lookout place and look down on things to get perspective, to see the big picture. And so the balcony here has always intrigued me, because I want to suggest to you that I think Jesus lived out his life viewing the world around him from the balcony. He wasn't enticed to enter into the tug of war and the frustrations and the arguments, and even though he was tempted on so many occasions to get in there and get dirty and talk about taxes and marriage and adultery and all these different things, and that he was people tried to get him to engage in, he always entered from a high place. And he always, if you read through the Gospels, you'll see this. Jesus always responded by elevating people's vision, by getting them to look from a higher place and to look down on the circumstances of life and see them from an eternal perspective. Now, that doesn't happen overnight, and it actually takes some discipline and training, because our tendency is to live in the push and pull of every day, and get our battles and fight our battles and do all those things that kind of are part of the busyness of life. But I think as God's people, at least on a regular basis, we have to get up on the balcony, look down on the world around us, ourselves, our marriages, our families, our community, and see things from God's point of view. Does that make sense? Because ultimately, it's God's point of view, God's vision. That's the important vision. That's the one that should guide us in how we approach everyday life. And so I want to share with you a few things that have shaped my worldview that's continuing to grow and evolve. And it's, even in later stages of life, I'm a little closer to the end than the beginning. I still find, in fact, now more than ever, I'm aware of how my understanding of God's kingdom and God's point of view is shaping who I am, and hopefully I'm continuing to grow. Psalms 92 encourages us that those who trust the Lord will remain fresh and flourishing even in old age. And so some of the stories are about myself, some of them are about Wanda and I, but hopefully they'll give you a little bit of a window into who we are. And then I want to end by just recapping the scriptures, looking at the scriptures that were read, and hopefully help us to get that fresh perspective on who we are in God's kingdom. So just a quick kind of reference point, just so you know, and I don't know if I've shared any of this the few times that I've been here at the church and had a chance to speak to the congregation, but Wanda and I have been married for 38 years next month. We have, thank you, she's put up with a lot, and We have 5 married children who all live actually within half an hour or 45 minutes of here. We have 17 grandchildren, and so we have a busy house at times. This afternoon will be one of those times. We're looking forward to that. And so God has blessed us with a large family, and we're grateful for that, and we enjoy that. But some of the things that have shaped who we are actually go back to before we had children, and for me, before I even met Wanda, or at least before we were married. And I want to start by telling a little story that was formative for me. I actually, as a child, attended Braeside Camp on the other side of the river here. Some of you will be familiar with Braeside. As a little guy, 8 years old, I believe I was, I put my hand up and said, I want to follow Jesus. But it wasn't until about 10 years later that it really began to be something that I understood and that I began to live out. And I go back to a season in life where I grew up in a church, attending church. Every time the doors opened, we were there. I kind of joke, I cut my teeth on the back of the pew in our church, sucking on the pew during the service, and grew up in a Christian environment, in what I would call a relatively healthy home, a Christian home. And so, as grateful as I am for that, that was also a bit of a challenge, really developing my own understanding, my own faith in God. And so, as I approached my later teens and was entering to college, I really began to question and wrestle with, well, is this thing that I've spent most of my life being involved in actually meaningful? Is it real? And I could share a lot of stories, but one in particular where I went on I was in Humber College in Toronto, had the summer, a few weeks at the end. I wanted to go on a bike trip, headed down towards Nova Scotia on my bike, not my motorcycle, but a pedal bike. And my dad took me part of the way, and we dropped me off, and I was heading down past Quebec City out on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River. And he had slipped me $20, and this is a long time ago now, to say, if it rains, get yourself a hotel room. $20 wouldn't get you a hotel room today, but anyway, so you can tell how long ago this was. And so I did that. I was out a few days on my bike trip, and it looked like rain, so I found this tiny little hotel that was in a little town called Saint-Simon, and it was probably no bigger than probably the average size bathroom. It had a little twin bed and a tiny little room with a bathroom, and I could get my bike inside, and there was nothing in there other than a light switch. And it rained for 3 days. And so I had to add some money to what my dad gave me, but I spent 3 days. And one of the purposes of this trip was I wanted to spend some time investigating who Jesus was. And obviously I turned to the Gospels to find that out. And so I spent 3 days reading the Gospels over and over again. And the reality is, I got introduced to Jesus in those 3 days, trapped in a hotel room in the rain. And I look back on that as an incredibly formative time for me, where I moved from just simply absorbing my parents' and my family's faith, my family's cultural experience of being a Christian, and it became real to me. And I began to be introduced to the person of Jesus Christ through the Gospels. And that was powerful in my life, and focused me on not just the peripheral stuff of being a Christian, but what it meant to be in relationship with Jesus. And that has continued to be really a powerful part of my experience of following Jesus, is getting to know him, reading the Gospels. The Bible I had at that time, if you look at it, you know how you get the gold stuff on the edges of I don't know if they do that still or not, but the 4 Gospels, it's all worn off and it's dirty, so there's all the gold, and then there's this brown strip because I was leafing through the pages so much. And so that began to shape how I understood what it meant to be a follower of Jesus and what it meant to live out that discipleship in the real world. Now, that was by no means the end. But it wasn't long after that Wanda and I got married, and we spent, and this is a long story, but I'll shorten it up because of time. We spent most of the first year of our marriage in Israel, living on a kibbutz. Anyone familiar with a kibbutz, Israel? It's a communal farm system that was really the beginnings of the Jewish people coming back to Palestine and establishing the state of Israel. And so most of the first year of our marriage was spent not in Canada and not with our family and not in familiar surroundings, but alone in Israel on a communal farm as a volunteer, working, doing things like picking avocados and cooking in the fish ponds. One of my jobs, we actually ended up there during the Lebanese War in 1982. And so we experienced not only living in Israel, we experienced living in a war zone. And one of my jobs was actually to maintain and look after the bomb shelters that I ended up spending some time living in for a while during that conflict. And so that was very formative. But what it showed us and how it shaped us was, one, it set a trajectory of service for us, because that was essentially what we were doing there. We were working and serving. It was a mission, but it was a mission that was just there to develop relationship. But it also showed us that when we were pulled out of our normal surroundings, where the Christian faith was sort of the dominant influence in society, at least, this is quite a few years ago now, and we had grown up in relatively happy, safe, comfortable homes with good families, and be transplanted to where you're actually the minority, you're not the influencer, you're actually, in some scenarios, looked upon as pagan, at least those who have rejected Judaism and believe in this man named Jesus. And so you can imagine how that shaped us, but it took us out of our denominational setting and allowed us to understand and really begin to understand what the foundational qualities of living out our faith really were. The things that were cultural, that aren't bad but aren't necessarily biblical, and the things that were actually fundamental to really living out our faith. And so that, there's a verse, you may be familiar with this, in Deuteronomy 24. It says, if a man is recently married, which I was, he must not be sent to war or have any other duties laid on him. For 1 year, he's to be free to stay at home and bring happiness to the wife he married. That was a law. And so we had our first year. I didn't go to war, but we actually found ourselves in a war. But it was an incredibly formative time for us. And it began to shape how we saw the world. Some of you are aware that we spent, moving to a new story now, came back to Canada, started having children, ended up being the director of Circle Square Ranch. Are you familiar with Circle Square Ranch out here in the highway? Some of you are maybe, if you're young enough, maybe we were the directors and you went to camp. But we began to direct a children's camp, Circle Square Ranch. It started in Kitchener. And Christian camping became a 30-year adventure for us, and participating both in terms of directing the camp and also overseeing all of Circle Square camps. There was 9 at one time across coast to coast from Newfoundland to BC. And so, again, those were very formative, because what the camp does, if you're familiar with camping is a temporary community, and we began to see the influence and impact that a temporary community. Have you ever gone away on a retreat somewhere or on some sort of special conference or some place where you go and people gather and you don't know it's a temporary community? You probably understand how impactful that can be, because all of your surroundings are new. Everything about what you know and how you manage life is sort of put behind you for a period of time, and you enter into a new dynamic, new relationships, new experiences, and they have a huge impact on you. And that's one of the reasons why we gather in this temporary community weekly, is to experience things that we don't experience throughout the week in the same way as the corporate body of Christ. And we should really begin to grasp and understand how special this is. How remarkable it is for a couple of hundred people to get together and sing songs to God corporately, hear from God, at least hopefully hear from God through someone who spent some time preparing, and to allow that to influence our lives. That's absolutely unique in most of the world's experience. And this is a special place, a special way of coming together and being shaped. And so I also began to appreciate both the church in the formal sense in this way, but also how the church functions in different contexts, camping, Christian camping being one. Little story, real quick, a sub-story. Some of you may know Arnie Small, home building center up here the road. Arnie's place down here on Highway 2. For 2 years, we ran camp on Arnie Small's farm here in Paris when we were transitioning from Kitchener to Brantford. And we'd have several hundred kids come to camp. I won't go into all the details, but a couple of months ago, I was at a barbecue, a men's barbecue at Arnie's farm. Arnie's a good friend. We've known each other for a long time. And Arnie did a little tour of his farm, so he took a group of men on a hay wagon down the pathway, down to the Nith River, beautiful spot on the river there. And he came up with a group of people, and a friend of mine was talking to him, and he came up and he was crying. And so you go, like, what's going on? Arnie doesn't cry a lot. What's happened? What took place? And he says, there was one of the guys on the wagon who was telling me his story that he came here when the camp was here as a little boy. You can see how long ago it is. And this is where he met Jesus, and he's been serving him ever since. And this is like 20 years later. And what I'm telling you that story is that we began to see that God doesn't only just want to impact adults, but the commitments that children make. I see the stuff here. We had just recently had camp, right? Jill, am I correct on that? This is meaningful. This makes a difference in lives. And so this fellow was telling Arnie about his experience of being introduced to Jesus at camp 20 years ago. And he's still following. And so for Arnie, who's a softie inside, it just got him. Like, okay, I opened up my property. And that life was impacted as a young person. And so again, that shaped the experience of running camp and dealing with children really shaped our understanding of the church, that it functions here and it functions out there. Because guess what? We are the church. Not this, but we, us, people. And we have this wonderful place to meet, and it's great to have it, but it's meaningless without the people, because that's where the real work happens. Most of you are would probably say there's not been very many sermons, this may be one of them, that's changed your life. It's hard, you may leave here in a half an hour and go, what did he say? I don't remember what he said. It was something about camp. There was a thing in Israel. Like, we forget, don't we? Like, it's not very often we go and sit and listen to someone for, a half an hour or so, and it changes our life overnight. But I had this one experience, and it's the same for me. It's the accumulative part that's actually meaningful. But I had this one experience listening to someone speak, and he started his talk by asking a question. And he started this question, he asked this question, and I, at that time, was pastoring. Wanda and I were pastoring church here in Brantford. We were committed to seeing the church grow, and we were seeing some good things happen. But he asked this question, he said, does the church have a mission, or does the mission have a church? And to be honest, as a pastor and someone who was committed to leading a church, a congregation, that messed with my head for a long, long time. I left kind of, okay, I'm not going to quickly answer that. Does the church have a mission, or does the mission have a church? And that one question on that one sermon really began to influence my understanding as a church leader. what's this all about? Why are we doing these things every Sunday? And so I began to work through that. And added to that, we're going to end by reciting the disciples' prayer. Anyone know the disciples' prayer? We actually call it the Lord's Prayer. Bad name. Really not a good name. It was the prayer that Jesus answered. He said to the disciples when they asked, how do I pray? He said, well, pray like this. This is your prayer. I have other prayers, and we can read those in different parts of the Gospels. But the Lord's Prayer, what we call the Lord's Prayer, is really the disciples' prayer. And I grew up in an era, most of you probably did, going to school, where we recited that every single day before school started. Anyone do that when you were in high school, most of you, some of you? I have recited that literally thousands of times. And it's not been till probably in the last 8 to 10 years that I've really began to understand the implications of that prayer, which is kind of embarrassing, but also great revelation. If you think about that prayer, what Jesus tells us to pray, God, your kingdom come, God, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He didn't teach us to pray, God, God, please come quick so we can get out of this bad place and get to heaven. It was actually, no, how do we get God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven? Have God's kingdom come. And so it turns out, if you really think about the implications of that prayer, I grew up thinking, well, our job as Christians was to get people into heaven. It turns out that it's actually about getting heaven into people. It's actually about helping people understand God's love and mercy and his desire to reconcile. And my job is to do that. Now, we have the hope and the promise of heaven, yes. But that's not the destination necessarily for us right now. The destination for us is to actually, how do we take this message of God's kingdom out into the world and carry it ourselves? And so, as I thought about this idea of, well, does the church have a mission or does the mission have a church? And if the mission that Jesus taught us to pray was that God's kingdom would come and his will would be done on earth as it is in heaven, well, I better start rethinking some of this and began to see the church, and maybe this visual will help you, as a vehicle, not a destination. Does that make sense? The church is a vehicle. It's a way for us as a community of believers to move towards establishing God's influence, the attributes of heaven coming to earth. And so we began to process this and recognize that what happens in here is great and necessary and good, but it's only part of what we're called to do, and that is to actually go out and in our sphere of influence, and every one of you has a sphere of influence, begin to bring this message of reconciliation as ambassadors of Christ. And so we're going to look at that really quickly, these verses from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And I won't reread them, but I maybe pick out a couple of phrases that really stand out to me. First of all, we're ambassadors. Anyone here ever been a diplomat, an ambassador in another country? You go and you represent your home country in a foreign land, and you work to deal with the transactions and the issues and the integration and the back and forth between where you're from and where you're stationed. It's a great way of illustrating who we are as Christians. And so, first thing here is that for Christ's love compels us. So we do this not just simply as a duty, but we do it because of the great love that has been shown to us and the forgiveness that's been shown to us. For Christ's love compels us. And so because of that, I love this phrase in verse 16. It says, "From now on we regard no one from a worldly point of view." What does no one mean? It means no one, right? Nobody here. We don't view each other from a worldly point of view. We don't view anyone out there from a worldly point of view. We view everyone from the balcony. an eternal soul that Jesus died for, that God wants to be reconciled to. And so that's how we function. That becomes our worldview, an others-centered worldview. It's not about us anymore. And as an ambassador is not there for their own business. They're there for the business of the kingdom that they represent. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Therefore, if any was in Christ, he's a new creation. The old is gone, the new is here. This is the new part. This is the part that continues to be renewed and evolve in myself and hopefully in all of us. We begin to more and more take on that eternal perspective that we are here for others. In fact, we've heard it said, you may have heard this line, that the church is the only organization that exists for its non-members. It exists for its non-members. Our call is to those who are not here. We come together in order to equip ourselves, support each other, and to be equipped to go out and make a difference in our world, to bring God's kingdom, that his kingdom would come, his will would be done on earth, not just in this building, but in all of the spheres of it, all of the functions of society out there. And we have the privilege of doing that, representing God, because actually, that's what it tells us, is that it says God is making his appeal through us. We are therefore God's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. Now here's the thing. It actually is important that we understand that we're new creations. We're not just damaged people who got repaired, or with a few boo-boos that we put Band-Aids on and God sort of dusted us off and said, we're actually becoming a different person. A person with a different understanding of the world around us that motivates us and causes us to act differently. From the balcony, we don't need to get involved in the battles, the controversies, the pushing and pulling. I want my way, you want your... We actually see it from above. We look down and say, okay, God, what's your will in this situation? What honors you? What brings about your plans and purposes? I, for one, love the ability to live that way. I can remove myself from the confrontations and the battles of getting my way, getting this worldview, oppose this worldview, because we see that all around us, don't we? We see it in the political realm in particular, clashing of worldviews. Nobody wins in that. It's just one group planning to take over where the other group is, and that. We get to rise above, see it from God's perspective, and say, how do I bring about God's plan and purpose? So we are therefore God's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us, because he is making his appeal through us. And so here's the final part of this. What I find is that I'm very slowly exchanging my earthbound worldview and my short-sightedness for God's eternal worldview. My question to you is, how are you doing on that? That's the heavy lifting of being a follower of Jesus, of changing, of being transformed into the image of Christ. Do you have a growing awareness of your part in God's redemptive mission? Because you do have a part to play. No question. All of us do. A part to play in God's redemptive mission for the world around us. Are you more enamored with God's love and grace for you that translates into patience and understanding for others? Or are you more adamant, more, I want it my way? Are we growing? Are you more convinced than ever of the lordship of Jesus, but growing wiser in how you engage with the world around you to see Jesus made famous, to make him attractive to others? And are you spending more time on the balcony seeing things from God's perspective so that you can represent him well in your sphere of influence, your job, your family, your neighbors, within the church here? Because here's what we can do. We can insert a word into the disciples' prayer that God's kingdom would come and that his will would be done in Paris as it is in heaven. That's our mission. That's our mission. The mission as a church. Our mission is to see God's will be done in Paris as it is in heaven. We're going to end today. We have a couple more songs, and then we're going to end by saying the disciples' prayer together. So let's kind of prepare our hearts for that. But I think, Chuck, am I right? We've got a couple more songs, so I'm going to invite the worship team back, and then we're going to end our benediction will be to recite the disciples' prayer together, and hopefully may have a little bit of a different ring for us today.